Morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture session. My name is Julian. Hello to everybody on Instagram and hello to everybody on YouTube. Quick update. I am so incredibly grateful for all your kind messages of support following my car crash incident. As you can tell, I'm doing pretty okay, all things considered. I'm a little bit banged up, but I am receiving treatment for my neck and back, so the show can go on. But I do want to take a short moment to just express my gratitude for everybody who reached out, everybody who sent a message. It's really surreal to have an enormous group of people who care about you, who want you to be happy and well. And there was so much warmth and kindness that I received from you that it just really, truly, it really made my week, and it really helped me in a very difficult situation. So thank you guys so much. I really do genuinely appreciate it. And I just want to reassure everybody that apart from some like basic stiffness, everything is fine. And that is true for Jeneline as well. So thank you guys so much. That really, really does mean a lot to me. It's been a busy week because I've been finalizing the edits for the upcoming ebook titled Spurious Infinities, Zizek on Postmodernism. Yes, someone just noticed a bird outside. That's right, I have a bird feeder, and we get woodpeckers, young woodpeckers that tend to really enjoy the bird feeder. So if you're lucky, you might get to see one, or I'll post a video later. I like to sit here working on the other side of the desk and I can see the birds feeding. Yes, so it's been a busy week. I've been working on the final edits for my ebook titled Spurious Infinities, Zizek on Postmodernism, and that's going to be coming out on Wednesday. So if you'd like to download that book, I've actually made a limited offer available on Patreon where you can get both the previous ebook and the current ebook available for the price of one. So basically, if you sign up for the pre-sale, if you sign up before Wednesday, you can download the previous ebook from the previous lecture series, plus on Wednesday, the new ebook that's coming out. And it's like you're paying for one, but you're receiving two. Of course, thank you so much for the patrons who make this possible in the first place. Being able to put together these types of texts that are completely uncommercially viable, that would not sell, that would not make sense to a publisher, that are really designed for you and to help you sort of grasp and synthesize for myself what is in these lectures, it's such an incredible privilege. And being able to work in that fashion within a learning community and for a receptive audience of fellow learners is just absolutely incredible. So huge thank you to the patrons as per usual. You know who you are. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. And our weekly ritual, I would really appreciate it if you're watching, if you could briefly leave a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. That is what I really love. I could spend an hour just doing call outs. The idea that we are communicating internationally, coming together around philosophy and theory is mind-blowing to me. And in this sense, I am a very old-fashioned, naive idealist because I really do believe in the power of ideas to bring people together. Hello to Italy, philosophy student, good morning. Very much missing Rome today. South Africa, Ohio, Colombia, Los Angeles. I have been to Italy, yes, I spent a lot of time in Rome. Hello, Dallas, Rome again, that's incredible, good morning. Krakow, Poland, hello, Arkansas. Romania, hello, Romania. Germany, near Heidelberg. I actually used to study and live in Freiburg, so I know that region very well. Dubai, greetings Dubai, Brazil, Croatia, Pakistan, India. It's so cool, it's really great. Cambridge, I used to work in Oxford and I used to visit Cambridge quite frequently. Iran, hello Iran, power to you. Vietnam, it's incredible. Thank you guys. That is still, even though I've done this for years now, that remains so thrilling to me. Hello Ethiopia, hello Mexico. It remains absolutely thrilling to me to get to feel connected to you. Hello Philippines. I really, really appreciate that. So today what I want to do today is I'd like to tackle the one remaining question that we haven't really discussed very much in the book and in the lecture series. This previous lecture series was dedicated to the idea of postmodernism, specifically Zizek's analysis of postmodernism, which I dubbed spurious infinities, which is something that Zizek writes about in one of his books. But the one thing that we really haven't tackled very much is the idea of postmodernism. In fact, you could make the argument that the very idea of postmodernism and writing a book about postmodernism is a little bit quaint, a little bit old-fashioned, almost. And so today I want to talk about the idea of postmodernism and to what extent it's a viable topic, interesting, and to what extent we should also be critical of it and perhaps even somewhat suspicious. So you don't have to have any knowledge of theory. This is going to be a pretty light lecture in which I summarize some of the key ideas of the ebook and I present them in a way that opens up new questions as we move forward. If you will, this is like the prologue and the book promo at the same time. If you'd like to download the accompanying ebook, which is about 100 pages, and you can read the entire argument in written form, like I said, that's going to be available on Wednesday on Patreon. And if you'd like to sign up for the pre-sale, you can get the previous ebook and the new ebook for the price of one. All that and more on www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I'll post the link on Instagram and YouTube as well. Okay, so you may recall this actually. There's, to my mind, the best example of what you might call postmodernism was a couple of years ago when a Banksy painting was sold live at auction. And you're probably familiar with Banksy's murals and the manner in which the very idea of this sort of popular graffiti art that lends itself to being a meme and being spread and disseminated online is a kind of postmodern artistic movement. It's something that works allegorically, symbolically, it makes references to politics and to what's happening in the news. It's something that always contains a kind of underlying quip, a joke, or a message. It can be easily reproduced. By its very nature, it can be reproduced not just on the wall by means of stencils, but you can also reproduce it onto a screen print or a poster or even a postcard. And thereby the very idea of ownership of a Banksy becomes spurious and extended. In this sense, Banksy appears as the quintessential postmodern popular artist, an artist who taps into a kind of whimsy by which the art object of Andy Warhol, which was, if you will, very self-serious and ironic, suddenly becomes re-imbued with a form of sincerity and political engagement. However, where you can really see, to my mind, the emergence of what might be referred to as a postmodern moment was precisely in this live presentation of the Banksy painting being sold at auction. The key here, of course, and you may recall this from the news at the time, was that the painting wasn't just sold at auction, but that at the exact moment that the painting was sold, in other words, that a buyer had been found in the bidding war, that the painting suddenly, in a pre-established mechanism, a kind of sabotage, if you will, started to destroy itself. It started going through a shredder. At the exact moment that the piece of art was sold, it started to be shredded. In other words, it was destroyed. Now, on the one hand, we have here a postmodern combination of two forms of art. One, the sort of classic figurative or even allegorical depiction. I believe it was like a girl with a balloon or something like this that was being sold. And then we have the performance art. We have the staging of an event, which is a one-time, quote-unquote, experience, if you will, which is the destruction of the art. In this precise sense, the shredder is part of the work of art. Nevertheless, this remains on the level of the postmodern. After all, we simply have here, again, a kind of spurious intersection between multiple frames and modes of engagement with depiction that are coming into contest with each other. And yet, what makes this moment postmodern is, of course, that instead of the public simply reacting in shock, instead of the owner of the painting falling to the ground in tears that his precious artistic possession had been destroyed, everybody seems to very quickly realize that by means of being partially shredded, the painting had not depreciated in value, it had of course simply increased in value. That one of the spurious abstractions or spurious infinities that takes place not just within postmodernism, but specifically within the post-postmodern, is this extension of surplus value. That the value is no longer simply attached to the art object, but that the very destruction of the object is now itself a form of increased surplus. And here we have what, to my mind, is one of the key principles of what you might call post-postmodernism, is that it doesn't actually function as a genuine alternative to the postmodern, but that it instead stages a pseudo-revolution by which the very logic, what used to be called the cultural logic of late-stage capitalism, which is code for postmodernism for Frederick Jameson, is extended into its seeming antithesis. In other words, it continues, it remains spurious, and yet it precisely seems to have been resisted at this very moment. Think about, for example, even during the Black Lives Matter movement, when it was at its peak, there was a certain day in which users, social media users, decided that instead of virtue signaling, instead of simply posting messages of tacit or explicit support for the protests, that they would stage a so-called blackout. You may recall this. And during this blackout, essentially social media users posted black squares. Everything became a black square on their stories on Instagram, on their posts. This is pre-TikTok, which is kind of interesting, right? There's no black videos yet, no reels. And this sabotage, this blackout of social media is, of course, again, a pseudo-revolution. It is distinctly postmodern. It's almost as if you took Malevich's black square and you rendered it into content. In other words, what we have here is what appears to be a form of resistance, a form of symbolic engagement, which nevertheless becomes a reified version of participation. In other words, you could say that the black square, which was posted in support of the BLM movement, is thereby resistance reified as content. And this is something that we're all experiencing right now, which is the contentification of life as such. That unless it exists as content, it doesn't exist. Think about fashion shows today who will hire pop singers like Rosalia recently at the Louis Vuitton show to walk the runway whilst performing their hit songs to ensure in very overt fashion that these videos of the performer will then take the fashion show on its coattails onto the social media stratosphere. Again, this isn't a normative criticism. I'm not saying this is bad, but here we have what you might call a post-postmodern feature of contemporary life, which is not simply that we have the fracturing of meaning. For example, you could argue that for there to be streetwear on a high couture fashion show would be a form of postmodernism. Here we have the meeting of the high and the low, the sacred and the profane, the internalization of the fast fashion market into the couture world. But what makes it post-postmodern is specifically that the only way in which this can then reach us on our screens, in which we can react and enact with it, is that we have the pop star who has to popularize it. Now, this synthesis between art and popular culture is, of course, not new and not in any way related to post-postmodernism as such. You could even see it within sports, for example, the long-standing relationship in the NBA between athletes and rap artists, where the rap artists will make the athletes seem more popular and vice versa. This, in and of itself, is not post-postmodern. So what might we refer to post-postmodern? There's a beautiful example that I'd like to share with you that I read recently, which is related to one of the key attributes of postmodern cultural mores. A less fancy way of saying this is political correctness. Political correctness is often presented as one of the key postmodern attributes, which presents itself as a kind of universalizing gesture by which everybody should avoid being offended or avoid being harmed. In other words, it presents itself as inclusive or emancipatory, that we should create a safe space for everyone in which nobody feels excluded. And yet often, and this is an argument that I'll make using an example, often this very insistence on the inclusive universal frame masks a very reactionary, recessive, or regressive, if you will, particularizing agency that is distinctly non-revolutionary. So let me explain for a moment. There's a beautiful example that I saw recently, which was the AFP, the Associated Press, released its style guide. And the style guide was widely mocked, and it was widely accused of being politically correct. Now, what was the problem with the style guide? At a certain point, the style guide said that writers should try to avoid using the word the, T-H-E. Why? Because the word the article the, could imply that people were being unfairly grouped into a pre-existing category or label. For example, the style guide suggested that instead of saying the rich, we should write people who are rich, or some people who are wealthy. And here we have something really interesting, right? Because one of the key, most important Marxist ideas is precisely that the fight for resistance always has to take place on the level of the universal, that it can never be a particularizing instance. In this exact sense, when you see a slogan like, eat the rich, it's precisely eat the rich, not eat some rich people. And what's key about this distinction is that the problem is not whether or not some rich people are good and whether some rich people are bad. In other words, it's not a normative analysis of the relative ethics of the wealthy. Instead, it's precisely saying that the very idea of wealth and the extreme injustice and structural inequality that has to take place in order for such wealth to then retroactively reify itself as being ideologically normatively good, in other words, I deserve this, that this very tendency is what is ideologically suspicious. To put that a little bit more simply, you can't simply eat some rich people where there are some bad apples and the others are good. The whole point is to attack or to change the system of wealth inequality in and of itself. Now, what this means, or actually let me give you another example. You may know this one already. We have an example of this from Saint-Just. Saint-Just, who famously writes during the French Revolution that the point of putting the king on trial isn't to determine whether or not he was a good king. Instead, the point of putting the king on trial is to put him on trial because he is king. In other words, the thing that is being judged isn't whether he was a relatively good or bad king amongst the lineages of kings. Instead, the attack is on the level of the universal. What is being put on trial is the very idea of the monarchy itself. Here we can go back to the idea of eating the rich versus eating some rich people. The universal frame is necessary because it is only by eating the condition of wealth inequality, in other words, the condition of being rich, that something can actually be done. Whereas if you single out specific wrongdoers within the class of the elites, the wealthy, etc., you simply succumb to a normalizing argument that tacitly supports the continuation of wealth inequality. In other words, that as long as we can have enough good rich people, then the rich can continue to exist. Now, back to the idea of the AP Style Guide. The AP Style Guide thereby presented if you've missed this, basically the AP Style Guide suggested, let me reframe, that instead of writing the rich, one should take out the and simply write some people with wealth. And that this was supposed to be politically correct. This was supposed to be inclusive, mindful that people are different and that not everybody is the same. And yet it's precisely at this level of the insistence on the particular experience that we lose the emancipatory revolutionary core, which is to look at the structural condition of wealth inequality rather than on the particular moral features of some people who are wealthy. And so here we have to make the seemingly irrational gesture. We have to insist on it, which is to always emphasize the universal. Think about police killings. Instead of saying there are some bad policemen, you have to emphasize that the police, capital P, is the universal problem, a problem from which these killings arise. Hence also why abolish the police and tax the rich, while seemingly irrational, anarchic statements, are precisely genuine forms of resistance and not postmodern politically correct, because they emphasize that the problem stems from within the structural conditions of the manner in which the universal is made as such. This is why it's important to emphasize the. Now, in a less politically charged fashion, I was actually very pleased by the way in which the Twitter staffers of the French embassy responded to this AP style guide, which is very clever. They said, yes, indeed, we should take out, I'm rephrasing here, right? But the quip was, yes, let us take out the. The is now considered offensive. Let us stop saying the French. Let us start saying instead people who suffer from Frenchness. And that is, to my mind, a beautiful, ironic, acerbic response to this, right? People who suffer from X. Instead of saying the wealthy, let us say the people who suffer from wealth. And of course, here we have the perfect inversion of what is thereby another post-postmodern feature, which is that one apologizes for one's own privilege. Think about it. What is the surplus enjoyment that takes place beyond the material world of objects and wealth? In other words, what could be more enjoyable than having everything? Well, what could be more enjoyable than having everything is also simultaneously having nothing. This is the sadomasochistic logic of corporate CEOs who enjoy like being with a dominatrix on their night off. It's like they get to be gods during day, and at night they also want to be the slave. They want no enjoyment to be lost, neither the enjoyment of being the master nor the enjoyment of being the submissive slave. And this is exactly what we find within the post-postmodern etiquette, if you will, of apologizing in advance for your own privilege, saying, I know I'm privileged, but, or I'm speaking from a position of privilege, or what I'm going to say reveals my privilege, etc. And it's almost a little bit like the new form of nouveau riche speak is thereby precisely to suggest I am undeserving of my wealth, unlike the riffraff who have worked their way up. And here we have something that I think is distinctly post-postmodern, which is that there's a surplus that is extracted from within what appears to be the negation of the thing itself. In other words, it's no longer simply the enjoyment of having access, as rich people likes to say it, to money, but specifically being able to apologize and pretend like you are not worthy of the privilege that is being bestowed upon you. There's a great joke that Zizek often uses that relates to this, where you may have heard this before, where there's a priest and a businessman and a poor man, a normal man, who are invited for an audience with the king. And the priest bows down to the king and says, "O mighty king, in front of you I am nothing." Then the businessman bows down to the king, or the rabbi. I might be getting the particulars wrong, but the joke works nonetheless. The businessman bows down in front of the king and says, "O king, truly in front of you I am nothing." Then the poor man bows down in front of the king and says, "O king, before you I am nothing." At this point, the priest and the businessman grab the poor man by the scruff of his neck and say, "Who do you think you are to declare that you are nothing?" Here we have again this not simply performative gesture, but precisely the surplus enjoyment of getting to declare that you are nothing. That is, of course, what the apologizing for your own privilege essentially entails. And so here we have again what you might call a post-postmodern feature. The extraction of a form of surplus that emerges from within the postmodern cultural logic of capitalism, or late-stage capitalism as such. Now, two of the dominant features of postmodern life, which today almost seem a little bit passé, are the idea of the post-political, on the one hand, and the post-ideological. Now, of course, there's a correlation between the two, and yet they are separate. If you will, what we have is the relationship between irony and cynicism. Now, cynicism often presents itself as being on the side of resistance. Like, I see through you, I am cynical, I understand how everything works. When I vote, I'm not simply giving my vote to you, I'm giving a vote to a corporation, etc. And yet, it's precisely within the postmodern existence that cynicism becomes a tool of the powerful. That cynicism becomes a kind of paralysis and an inertia. And what's so key here is that it goes hand in hand. That the post-political irony that we experience, in which everything becomes ironic, for example, the irony of the the irony of the Banksy painting shredding itself and becoming more valuable, is then supplemented by the cynicism which allows the politics of the day to continue as per usual. In other words, what we find is that we have an ideology which becomes ironic that then sustains a political paralysis which masks itself as enlightened cynicism. This is why one of the true acts of resistance must always take place on the level of extreme sincerity. That, in fact, the very idea of sincerity within the post-postmodern logic has become a kind of resistance. However, what's key here is that sincerity takes place on the level of the fool. The level of the fool is here precisely the person who pretends not to buy into the symbolic order. What's key here is that we have two sides of the same coin. Let me lay it out very clearly. Lacan has a beautiful maxim, which is, I can't pronounce it properly, but it's les non-dupes se errant, which means the non-duped are in the wrong, or the non-dupes are the ones who are duped. And essentially what Lacan means here is that the insistence on a pre-symbolic natural world, the engagement with the world an sich, is thereby not just a form of naivete, but a form of being an idiot or fool. This links to Lacan's maxim that the king who believes he is truly king is the ultimate fool. Essentially, you could imagine somebody walking into a courthouse, and you see a judge, and the judge is wearing a wig. And the man who is standing trial could say in front of the court, "Who are you to judge me? Can't you see that underneath the wig, this is simply another man? You probably have your own vices. Who are you to judge me? We are simply two men standing here in a courtroom." Now, this is, of course, precisely the idiot's approach, to disavow the symbolic importance of the courtroom and the wig and everything that comes with it. In other words, the manner in which power exists in the world is precisely on this denaturalized symbolic level in which the subject finds himself, but is also interpolated, to put it in Althusserian terms. However, any gesture that presents itself as being anti-symbolic as a form of resistance, for example, let's live in the woods in a communitarian fashion, let's make all our decisions in an egalitarian way, let's no longer have judges and kings, etc., will always find a return of the repressed, a return of the symbolic that makes itself manifest in other ways. Consider, for example, how in high schools, it used to be that you had to wear a uniform, like this is still common practice in the UK. And what's interesting is that even though students wear uniforms and they thereby wear the same things, there's supposed to be no distinction between them, there are tiny little ways in which alterations and hierarchies take place. Whether it's your posture, the way in which you carry your bags, if you wear a little hidden pin, the length of your skirt, which perhaps you get away with having slightly shorter than you're supposed to, the length of your hair. The symbolic returns, the social hierarchy returns and makes itself manifest despite the egalitarian insistence on the uniforms. And here's what's so funny is that often we think of uniforms as being distinctly like repressive. Remember how Steve Jobs who famously always wore the same turtleneck designed by a Japanese fashion designer, wanted his entire workforce to wear a uniform. In fact, he had a uniform designed for his workforce so that they would all wear the exact same thing. And they immediately rejected this as being totalitarian and oppressive, etc. However, when we look at the reality of people who wear uniforms, for example, in school, is that there's actually a sort of liberating quality to the uniform, which is that without the uniform, they would have to invest in lifestyle. They would have to scrutinize and analyze how every gesture, depending on the slogan on their shirt or the color of their lipstick or whatever, suddenly sends out political messages. And so here we have a certain irony, which you could call, again, the irony of post-postmodernism, which is that lifestyle, which is, in a sense, the post-political gesture of, instead of declaring your principles, you declare your lifestyle orientations, what subcultures and in-jokes you are part and parcel to, instead becomes a form of restriction. That having to identify yourself on behalf of the categories of lifestyle becomes a dehumanizing agency, even though it's supposed to be presented to you as a liberating force. And here we could see again how the naive embrace of the uniform would precisely be a form of liberation from the particularizing insistence on expressing your lifestyle, as it were. Now, I want to go back to what I was explaining here, which is the two sides of the same coin when it comes to naivete or not buying into the symbolic. Lacan has the maxim, as I said before, the non-duped are duped. Essentially, those who don't buy into the symbolic order, those who decry it as being a mask or the matrix, are the ones who are naively duped. That the truth lies thereby, in Lacanian terms, precisely not within what is underneath the mask, but within the mask as such. This goes back to a key ontological premise that lies dormant, essentially, within Lacan, until Zizek emphasizes the ontological dimension, which is precisely that instead of having a binary between fantasy and reality, that we only access reality through fantasy. Hence also Zizek's insistence on ideology. If ideology is the manner in which reality is grounded through a system of fantasies, in other words, pre-manufactured fantasies that are given to us as natural, as simply how it is, then the fight for resistance must always take place not on the level of reality, but on the level of fantasy. That the task that is necessary, that is required to change reality, is thereby precisely the insistence that one challenge and open and reframe the supplemental fantasy that allows the given to present itself as inevitable. Hence also why Zizek says that the definition of what it means to be a philosopher is that philosophy begins the moment one refuses to accept what exists as given. That thereby the task of the philosopher is not to endorse or embrace any symbolic order as such, but to find the very gaps, the momentary absence that exists within the symbolic and inhabit and take residence within that space, like the Diogenes who instead of sitting in the barrel sits within the gap or the crack within the symbolic order as such. These gaps emerge everywhere all the time. A protest movement that is seemingly irrational, that makes no sense, that has no leader or demands is a form of a socio-symbolic gap. Even an election is a form of a gap, where for a temporary moment we don't know who's going to win, and then retroactive we tell ourselves that the people have decided, when in fact it was simply the statistical, formalistic structure of the manner in which we decide, like voting regions and gerrymandering, that retroactively imposes upon us the certainty, the closing of this openness that was opened up through the election back into a master signifying frame of the people. Hence the task of the philosopher is to embrace and to insist on these moments of radical openness, rather than trying to immediately close them again. Here we can also see how truly traumatic events can present a moment of openness, like the absolutely shocking police killing video that you may have seen, which I have not seen, but which you may have seen over the past couple of days in Atlanta. And what's so interesting here is you can see what Zizek calls the hermeneutic temptation. The hermeneutic temptation, namely the temptation to interpret, to try to dissect the video, is thereby precisely always on the side of the reactionary right. If you go to the Daily Mail yesterday, if you went to the Daily Mail, their banner headline was, "Why so much violence? Was there a secret cause to this? Did the policeman know their victim? Was there some cover-up?" Essentially, this hysterical picking away at the supposed conspiratorial meaning or reason behind the violence, of course, is precisely a gesture to close the truly traumatic idea and frame, the moment, the traumatic event, which is that this killing had no meaning, that it was absent of meaning, that it was pure, horrific, excessive violence. And that thereby the very insistence on trying to interpret the event according to specific morals or pre-existing grievances or motives is precisely a way of trying to close the open gap of the trauma, which is thereby precisely a reactionary gesture that denies the idea of protest and revolt. It's also why I've been very impressed to see so many activists saying that they're less interested in talking about the video and they're more interested in talking about how do we end structural violence within the police as such, going back to the argument from before. And thereby we should see the fact that the police and that the local government insisted on very much laying the groundwork for how traumatic the video was precisely a conservative gesture, by which the emphasis was placed on the hermeneutic temptation of dissecting the video instead of emphasizing the structural manner in which these police killings will continue indefinitely or spuriously within the very organizing structure and the mechanism of state power. This is also why Althusser was correct, I think, when he insisted on the universalization of the idea of police. When Althusser writes "the police," contrary to the AP style guide, when he writes "the police," he meant not just the policemen or women, he meant institutions of governments, institution of education, legal institutions, and so on and so forth. That any institutionalization of power is thereby for Althusser capital P police. Now, this is a very lengthy way of explaining the two sides of the same coin when it comes to how to resist and the idea of the non-dupe is duped. So Lacan has this whole argument, which I've already explained, which is that the non-duped are thereby duped, that to insist on the direct engagement with reality without emphasizing the socio-symbolic order as having more truth. In other words, that the truth, for Lacan, the truth lies in the mask, not in what is supposedly underneath the mask. We have here the idea that you would be wrong to simply engage with the world on the level of neutral reality. The other side of the coin is, of course, that this practice, this embrace of the idea of stupid, neutral, non-symbolic participation emerges within post-postmodernism as itself a kind of resistance. Let's look for a moment at Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which is, of course, a very famous piece of, if you will, I would call it postmodern, but perhaps pre-postmodern, like postmodernism avant la lettre. We have a urinal that is brought into the gallery. The sacred gallery is now demonstrating a profane object, an object that is hidden away as such. Now, essentially we could imagine two responses to this, two responses which exist. The conservative response, which indicts this as excessive relativism of postmodernism, in which the beauty of art is lost and that we have to go back to classical, traditional forms of art that will then elevate traditional classic moral values, and that having the urinal in a gallery represents precisely the undermining of civilization, etc., etc. Then we have the more liberal postmodern attitude, which I find to be equally revolting, which is everything is art, and as long as you think it's creative and you've put it on a wall, it thereby becomes art by means of being in the institution of the museum, which, let's be clear, inverts the very subversive gesture of the fountain. The message of the fountain isn't everything can be art, even a urinal. The message is precisely that the invisible structuring mechanism is precisely not the form and the content, but the hidden form of the institution of the gallery as such. In other words, the message is precisely not everything is art or everything could be art. Instead, the message is nothing is art, that the very idea of art is what is made manifest in the institution of the gallery. And here we have to see the link between, Zizek has a great joke about this, where Zizek says that, he says, what if we take Malevich's Black Square and we took the fountain and we placed the fountain on Malevich's Black Square? We would thereby have a return to classical figurative symbolic art, namely the object of worship of modernism, namely the profane object rather than the sacred object placed back on the neutral frame of the figurative portrayal, like, Christ on the cross, etc. Anyway, the point here is that the transition that we make from, for example, Malevich's Black Square, which is a modernist painting par excellence because it takes the tension between form and content and simply turns it into its own content, into the fountain, which thereby presents that underneath this tension and interplay between form and content within the square lies a hidden element of structural form, namely the idea of the gallery, the institution. And then we have the postmodern conclusion, which has to be seen in dialogue with those two, which is Andy Warhol's art objects and the spurious reproduction of art as commodity and commodity as art, and a kind of Ouroboros eating its own tail. Thereby, we go not towards the liberal emphasis on everything is art, but precisely the idea is that nothing is art. And this is the problem of postmodernism, is that rather than opening up a seemingly universal horizon of artistic creative experience in which everybody can make and create art, the truth is that everybody can make and create content. And that thereby we argue that content equals art. And this is, in fact, I would argue, one of the most interesting developments within the sort of the Gen Z jargon, which is that instead of saying content, they simply say art, like as a general universal term. My art, I'm posting my art, I'm selling my art, my lectures are my art. Which isn't to say that it's not art, but it's precisely a post-postmodern response to the revolution that takes place within postmodernism, which is that, strictly speaking, nothing is art. That in the same manner in which the man who loves everybody loves nobody, that turning the art into everything is art leads precisely to nothing is art. And thereby we can go back to Lacan with his the non-dupes are duped. Because think about it, how do we resist this? You can't simply say, well, I'm going to make something which isn't art. And perhaps one way to resist the spurious intensification of abstraction is thereby precisely to insist on a naive, idiotic, stupid frame. Which is to say, rather than embracing the urinal, Duchamp's urinal, the fountain, as being the end of art and a kind of conservative hysteria, and equating it to the decline of social mores and values, which is sort of the two-punch operation that occurs within almost every conservative hysterical response to the modern, nor to embrace the liberal hysterical attitude that now everything is art and everything is precious and valuable and that everybody should be appreciated for their attempts at creativity, but to instead simply walk into the museum, unzip, and use the urinal for what it is. In other words, to pee in it. That, here we go, that perhaps the logical conclusion, the way to resist postmodernism isn't to extend it into an infinite sequence of post-postmodernisms, which simply reify the logic that is already within postmodernism as such, and that thereby isn't truly antithetical to it, but to simply insist on engaging with the modern in a naively sincere attitude to neuter the spurious infinite of the postmodern into a kind of base, vulgar, material reality. In other words, to allow modernism to unfold in its properly materialistic turn, instead of allowing for these spurious abstractions that take place within postmodernism and post-postmodernism, which of course are the perfect logical supplement to late-stage capitalism. And here we should also say, nobody really believes that we truly live in a postmodern era anymore. Post-postmodernism is simply the late-stage postmodernism. It's the same thing in its seemingly disavowed guise. Think about, again, what I said are two features of postmodernism. Post-political life and post-ideological life. The post-political insistence of the 1990s was that we lived in a technocratic age in which we had to leave the messy side of politics aside, and that we should focus on working with companies like McKinsey, who would regulate and we could outsource our problems to them and they would take care of it for us. Of course, now we have the famous return of the repressed. Could we think of anything more political than the era that we're living in now? A more politicized society is hardly imaginable, in which gas stoves suddenly become key object of contestation within the culture wars, etc. Versus the supposed post-ideological turn. Remember, Fukuyama's argument was a right-wing conservative Hegelianism, which was to take the idea of the end of history, which Hegel posited, and I talked about this last lecture, that Hegel declared himself as having stood at the end of philosophy, that he had completed philosophy. The question is, what happens after the end of history? Well, the Fukuyaman argument had been that after the end of history, we have the collapse of the idea of two blocks of power, namely the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. Recall also, for example, how we have kept the idea of the third world. We have the first world and the third world. And here we have the second world as a kind of vanishing mediator. No one really knows what the second world is anymore. Well, the second world is, of course, the world of the Soviet Union. And so we have the first world and the third world, and yet the second world has disappeared somehow. We now exist in a post-ideological world that is perfectly suited and tailored to the cultural logic of capitalism, which is that we only have a first world and a third world, and the third world can be systematically exploited to uphold the idea of the first world. Again, we should go back to the AP style guide and the idea of the rich. Rather than saying that we have, some third world countries which are more like first world countries and some first world countries which are more like third world countries, it's to say that the only reason we have first world countries in the first place is because of the continued existence of third world countries. That the very lens through which the third world is rendered third is precisely what upholds the first. It's not innate or natural a priori. It's not because we have a Protestant ethic that allows us to work harder and to be more deliberate in our goals. Instead, it's precisely to insist that the only reason the first world is first is because it systematically has rendered the majority of the population into global poverty. And so they're attached at the hip, they're not separate. And that's, of course, why the beautiful post-ideological gesture is to eliminate the second, quote-unquote, the missing piece within this link, which is the second world, the world of the Soviet Union, which of course was built on the idea, which of course became bastardized within the Soviet Union, of dialectical materialism and historical materialism, i.e. the philosophy of communism and the political project of communism. Now, Fukuyama even doesn't consider himself a Fukuyamian anymore. Who really believes in this idea of a post-ideological world? More than ever, we're facing a so-called clash of civilizations between the Russian advance on Ukraine and the Western insistence that it is a neutral guarantor of democracy. This stultification into preconceived frames of ideological obfuscation is a return of the repressed, of the ideological. No one in their right mind, not even the billionaires today, would insist that we live in an equal world. Nobody believes in the myth of capitalism as being the sea that rises all boats. And so what we're left with, and this is something that David Graeber has argued as well, or argued before he passed away, R.I.P. David Graeber, is that what we're left with are moralizing arguments. What we're left with are moral arguments about the supposedly natural deterministic behavior of how human beings are, and that thereby capitalism is something that is inherently human and linked to human behavior. And so we're stuck with a kind of pathetic moralizing behavioralism that has emerged in the post-postmodern absence of the supposedly post-ideological and post-political space. And this, thereby, is why the post-postmodern is not a true alternative or antithesis to the idea of postmodernism. In fact, one thing that I noticed online in the very brief research I did is that some of the most avid advocates of post-postmodernism appear to be reactionary conservatives who are saying modernism was a mistake. Where society and civilization went wrong was allowing Jewish people to write literature and to take on the arts, in other words, the advent of modernism in around the 1900s. And that thereby, in order to return to traditional life and classic art and the trajectory of civilization, we have to undo the quote-unquote cultural Marxism of postmodernism and of modernism. This then presents itself as postmodernism, a pseudo-revolution that thereby is completely antithetical to the idea of modernism, which postmodernism was supposed to be antithetical to as well. In other words, as I've argued before, this insistence that there is a kind of corruption within society that has led us astray from traditional values and moral living, and that art used to reflect the good, and now art simply reflects the lowest in society, that art has gone from the sacred to the profane. This reaction presents itself precisely as a pseudo-revolution, which some people call post-postmodern on the internet, a return to a pre-modern form of life, which is, of course, itself wildly post-postmodern. Again, we have the snake eating its own tail, the very insistence that what we should do to live a better life is thereby to attack modernism and return to a pre-modern life is, of course, completely symptomatic to contemporary alienated life. And here we have self-help ideologues who look towards all of the manifestations of structural inequality within capitalism, and they decide that the best way to solve it is to simply tell people how to exploit other people more efficiently, how to get rich quick, the secrets of the rich, and so on and so forth. When, of course, the secrets of the rich is precisely generational wealth and property ownership and nepotism. That the secrets of the rich are, in a sense, right out there in the open. And that the very idea that behind the curtain of these things lies some core of true, authentic genius that allows some people to rise to the top and has others think is precisely a symptomatic ideological disavowal of the manner in which structural inequality is reinforced through ideology, in other words, through fantasy. Now, I want to end here by saying that the key to the critique of ideology is thereby always to distinguish between something's purported goal and its aim. Think about, for example, one of the key imperatives within postmodern life, which is enjoy yourself, have a good time, make sure that something is fun, do something for you, take your time. This is usually then related to a consumptive purchase, like buy a new phone. Because let's face it, realistically, without a phone and access to the internet, you no longer exist as a citizen. Every basic part of life will be difficult for you, will be made difficult. Finding a job, being able to pick up your kids from school, being able to take a COVID test, and so on and so forth, that fundamentally we require our phones in order to exist and to be interpolated within society. That it's very, very difficult. In fact, if you want a true sign of privilege today, it's precisely being able to not be on your phone all the time, to disinvest yourself from engaging with the world through technology. Of course, technology is sold to you as this will economize your life, it will make your love life more efficient, your work life more practicable, it will make your leisure time more enjoyable, all of which is true, by the way. Just because it's true doesn't mean that it isn't pathological. This is like Lacan's well-known joke that the man who accuses his wife of cheating is pathological, even if it turns out that she is in fact cheating. The reality of whether or not she's cheating doesn't have a retroactive effect on his pathology, on the symptom, namely his jealousy. The same is true for alienated life. You have to have a phone. And yes, it is supposed to make you more efficient and happier, perhaps, and gives you better access to the internet and leisure time, etc., etc. You can connect with your friends. Of course, you could argue that part of the post-postmodern argument is simply that every problem is reified into a continuation into its own solution. For example, are you feeling lonely and isolated because you're not spending time with friends? How about social media that will bring more connection with your friends? Are you worried about climate change? Well, then buy an ethically produced car or pair of jeans. Like, we simply prescribe more as if it were a solution to the very thing that created the problem in the first place. Now, again, the critique of ideology thereby has to go from not looking at something's purported goals and look at its underlying aim. The purported goal of buying a new phone, for example, is faster access to the internet and more time that you can chat with friends and endless phone calls. There's many ways in which a phone economizes and makes your life more practical. And yet the underlying, that is the goal, right? The goal is to make your life more efficient, more well-adjusted to the cultural logic of late-stage capitalism. It's like you can use your phone for therapy, for example. At any time of the day, you could be sitting on the toilet, you could call your therapist. Again, which can be a good thing. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but it is symptomatic, it's pathological. That is the goal of this purchase. But the underlying aim is, of course, to never stop buying more stuff, to never stop upgrading your phone. The newest thing with phones now is that you simply trade in your old phone and you get the new one, that this hamster wheel continues over and over again, and that thereby the reinvention of your phone is equated with the reinvention of yourself. That the post-postmodern form of existence isn't simply the ironic meta-interplay of messages and meanings, but specifically the seemingly endless continuation, the spurious infinitive, of a constant reinvention of the self as a mechanized unit of the cultural logic that pushes forward the ideology of consumption and the incentive structures of late-stage capitalism. All of which is to say, I want to give you an example actually, before I get to that. Example. Usually, if you want to find the difference between something's goal and its aim, if you really want to get to the core of ideology, one of the ways to do it is to look at advertisements. Because advertisements emphasize either a fantasy or a fear. Often, the fantasy and the fear are intertwined. And here we can usually find the underlying aim that is buried within what appears to be the goal. Again, a phone. The goal appears to be you should buy a phone because it'll make your life more efficient. And let's look at one of the advertisements I've been seeing a lot for one of these phone companies. AT&T, I think. Or providers, network providers, I should say. Another postmodern development, of course, is that we don't buy the phone, we buy the network provider. But that's for another time. There's a beautiful advertisement from AT&T where a man comes in to ask about his old phone. And he puts his phone on the countertop. And as soon as he puts the phone on the countertop, the woman gasps, and people in the background avert their eyes. A mother covers the eyes of her children. In other words, the phone is so old that it is vulgar, that the phone is so disgusting because it is an old phone that has not been traded in, that it's almost as if the man had exposed himself in public, that he's being criminally indecent. And of course, this is where the sales assistant swoops in, grabs the phone, deposits it in a bag, and then says, you know what? Here is the new iPhone for you. And here we have such a perfect example of the ideological supplement to postmodernism, which is that the moralizing insistence that if you don't keep up, that if you have something that isn't the newest version of something, you are thereby disgusting. you are not worthy of public interaction, that you might even be arrested because you are so profane. In other words, the idealization of the new and the spurious consumptive practice of always upgrading for the new iPhone is now a necessary trait for survival within symbolic existence. That if you don't trade in your phone, you are a perv, essentially. And here we have again how you can see the ideological interplay between its purported goal and its underlying aim. The purported goal is create a new you, create a new life, buy a new phone, be a better person. The underlying aim is, except if you don't, you are vulgar and depraved and obscene and a perv, which is why you have to buy the new phone. And what is thereby presented to you as the opportunity of enjoyment is in fact the imperative to keep on enjoying. Hence also why the cultural logic of postmodernism is thereby reified into the post-postmodern drive to enjoy yourself more, to keep on enjoying, to never stop enjoying. And that thereby, even your own exploitation, that you have to work longer hours to keep up with the Joneses and buy more useless products, that even this exploitation of the self, which you've now outsourced to yourself by being more productive and more energized and working 3 shifts and 4 jobs and driving an Uber car, that this process of enslavement is then retroactively sold back to you as the very manifestation of your own agency. One can liken this to the old joke of a researcher who goes to a tribe of cannibals and says, "Are there any cannibals here?" To which the cannibal replies, "No, we ate the last one yesterday." This infinite spurious infinity, this spurious infinity of the cannibal who has just eaten the last cannibal, is the condition of post-postmodernism par excellence. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you being here. If you're curious, you can find all of this and more in my upcoming ebook titled Spurious Infinities, Zizek on Postmodernism, which will be available on Wednesday, I believe Tuesday midnight, maybe even. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to the patrons who allow me to keep working independently, to keep publishing these texts that correspond to the lectures in a way that is completely, or to some extent, detached from the sales incentives of popular publishing. I'm so grateful to you. I really hope that you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope that you've enjoyed this lecture series. I'm going to be picking up this discussion in about 10-15 minutes on Discord, where we're going to have another 45 minutes of discussion, which I very much hope that you'll join me for. Most of all, I'm so glad that you've joined me for this lecture. I really hope that it's been thought-provoking and helpful to you. And above all, thank you for caring. Thank you also for all of you who have sent me kind messages about my neck and my back following my car accident. The show must go on, and I'm so grateful to have started my Monday with you. If you'd like to pre-order my ebook, Spurious Infinities, Zizek on Postmodernism, you can do that right now on www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Plus, everybody who pre-orders now will be able to download the previous ebook for free. And most of all, I'd really like to invite you into our learning community on Patreon, where we have just a wonderful, just energy and like-minded exchange of interest in philosophy and theory and politics. Of course, this will also be uploaded to YouTube. In fact, hello YouTube. I know I've been absent recently. I'm going to try to film more videos now that the book is going to be out in a couple of days. Thank you guys so much. And I will see the Discordians, as Jeneline likes to call them, for the Q&A seminar in about 10 minutes. See you guys.